All right. So, one of the problems that I'm always running into when I talk about energy with people is this lingering notion that renewable energy costs more than fossil fuels. Right? This is a really hard thing to shake off. It doesn't seem like I succeed very well at convincing anybody that that there's been any change here. There's just this old, I'm just going to say, 25-year out of date philosophy that green energy costs more than traditional energy. And the problem that we have here is I think that this is one of those items that just needs the magic of time to shake off. All right, so I am like 37 years old and started studying this energy transition. You know, we didn't call it the energy transition back then, but around 2004. And at that time, industries like wind power, solar power, were just beginning to become commercial ventures. Like we were moving from the side of experimentation and startups and subsidization and stop and go policy from Congress and things like that, where everything was dependent upon government support. We were moving into commercialized business mode for these resources. We were moving from startup world to commercialization world. And by the 2010s, we effectively had commercialized renewable energy technology to the point that then we could start implementing major cost reductions and efficiency improvements. And by the late 2010s, 2016, 2017, 2018, the cost of producing electricity from, just say, solar panels had dropped below that of fossil fuels. Here we are in 2024, and I continuously run into opinions on social media, even in real life, where people are still thinking that these technologies are uncompetitive with fossil fuels and that there is no economic incentive to use them whatsoever, and they therefore migrate to this mindset that there must be some ulterior motive, some external force beyond money that is pushing people to build wind farms, to build solar farms, or even buy electric cars and heat pumps on the demand side of things. I've got a question taken from Quora, where we have a nice long response here that illustrates this mindset really, really well. And I'll read this and talk about it. But before I do that, what I'm thinking is going on here is we are in a situation where the technology has moved faster than the human mind can bend. The human mind is malleable, but it's not malleable enough for how fast this technology has advanced in terms of its economics. And the best example I can think of is Moore's Law. All right, so Moore's Law is in the world of microelectronics. You know, the things that define the computer, define the internet, define flat screen televisions, personal smartphones, electronics. You know, in just a few decades, we went from bulky vacuum tubes and things like that to transistors and integrated circuits. And even 20 years ago, the notion that we could store gigabytes and terabytes of information on something like this, that I can put a terabyte of information, a trillion bytes, whatever it is, on this little chip, was unimaginable in 2005. The best you could do was maybe 64 megabytes, right? At least for anything that's reasonably priced. Why? What changed? Why in the world is it now all of a sudden appearing to be so simple to stuff such huge quantities of information on one of these, a flash drive? Right? Why is it that hard drives in the 1990s were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars and like 4 gigabytes? Now, this is 4 terabytes, and that, as far as hard disks go, is small. You can get 30 terabytes, maybe even bigger than that at this point. I don't know how big they've gotten. Of course, that's a traditional magnetic spinning disk drive, which is, for most people, don't even use these anymore. They use solid state devices like flash drives, except it's in this format. Moore's law is the shrinking of microelectronics. Most of us are taught, oh, it's the number of transistors you can fit on a chip. Okay, some size of chip. Let's just say a square centimeter. Every 18 months, the number of transistors on a square centimeter of silicon was doubled. That is a powerful concept. Now, of course, we're told that it's about doubling, and it's about computing power, and it's about chip size and all these things. But in reality, what Moore's law is the cost of making those devices, right? We knew the physics, we understood the physics of the flash drive, right? Wherever I put it. We knew on paper that we could make a device that could hold a terabyte of data. But manufacturing that and putting it on a consumer product that they could purchase for $50, whatever they cost. I don't know what a terabyte flash disk costs these days, but whatever it is, that was what made Moore's law. Being able to do the volume manufacturing. The situation with renewable energy is exactly the same, right? We are shrinking the cost of producing the equipment needed to capture energy that is just free for the taking. You know, we knew 30, 40, 50 years ago that the amount of sunlight that hits the earth is a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver, or the amount of energy humans use is a tiny, tiny, tiny little sliver of what the sunlight is providing us. If we could capture just a small fraction of that sunlight and convert it into the forms that we need, this whole oil problem goes away, right? There's nothing in physics that is stopping us from doing it. We know we can build silicon chips that take that sunlight and turn it directly into electricity. We've known about that since the 1950s. Actually, we've known about that back to the 1800s when the photovoltaic effect was discovered. And we had the ability to make satellites that you launch into space. You know, that was the first application for solar power. We built these satellites. How do you power a satellite in space? You can't put gasoline in there and send it up there, and it's going to have a little 2-stroke engine and pot along all, you know, power the satellite. Now, and of course, batteries are going to die eventually. But there's this thing called the sun. Wow, right? If you could take that and use it to power the electronics on the satellite, you're set. And the cool thing about satellites was they're very high value products. It costs a lot of money to make and get a satellite in orbit. So therefore, even if the solar cells were expensive, they could still sell them. So then what we saw is a drop in the cost of solar cells once we started launching more satellites, because they got better and better and better at manufacturing them, got the costs down, right? The thing that's fundamental about both microelectronics, like flash drives, and solar cells, is the materials that they are made from are unbelievably abundant. Right, so here we have a silicon wafer with some kind of an integrated circuit patterned on it. I don't know what the circuit is, but it's definitely a multi-pin device. And this is manufactured from dirt, from sand, right? Abundant. It's not like it's made out of platinum. It's made out of really abundant materials. And the quest for human beings was to take sand, quartz, and purify it to the point where we can manufacture these chips out of it. And of course, that involves a whole bunch of complex, capital-intensive steps. But if you can make enough chips and sell them for a few pennies a piece, now all of a sudden paying off that investment is doable, very doable. And that's what made the microelectronics industry possible. That's what made your phone that you're watching this on, or your computer or your TV, possible. Is taking all that capital investment of manufacturing the quartz, making the silicon, making the ingot, making the wafers, fabricating the product onto the wafers, cutting it up into individual die, packaging those die, selling it to a TV manufacturer who puts it in their product over the millions and millions and millions and millions of devices. You can sell each one of them for $2 a piece. There's a lot of money on this thing. So the same exact philosophy applies to solar power, especially because you build a solar cell and you put it in a solar module or panel and you throw it out in the sun and it just lays there for years and years and years. And you make a lot of kilowatt hours off of that solar cell. And you can sell each of those kilowatt hours for 5 cents, 6 cents, 7 cents, whatever it is. And you're doing the exact same thing as you're doing with microelectronics. If this wafer is a silicon solar cell, instead of selling the individual little die that are on this wafer, I'm just going to, I don't know, there's a few hundred on here. I'm selling the kilowatt hours of electricity that it produces. Just take each kilowatt hour as equivalent to a die, to a little square circuit that you see there. It's the same economic model. A solar panel has, just say, 60 of these wafers on it. You lay it outside in the sun and it's going to produce 300 or 400 kilowatt hours a year for 2 or 3 decades. And you sell each of those for a nickel a piece. That's what you're doing here. Now, what the solar industry had to do that the microelectronics industry didn't really have to worry so much about is the quantity of material involved. So whenever I sell a integrated circuit, the amount of material is really small for each individual device. When I sell a solar panel, you have a lot of silicon there by comparison. So the more important thing for the microelectronics companies was to reduce the cost of production of the patterns that are on here and packages that it goes into. Basically automating that side of the manufacturing process. They weren't worried so much about the cost of the physical substrate as much as the downstream production of this structure that's on the surface. With solar manufacturing, they started off using the same exact substrates as microelectronics. And that's a problem because microelectronics requires a really high purity of material. Solar can get away with something a little less demanding. So when they started off using wafers made for microelectronics manufacturers, the wafer producers had not really had a reason to optimize the cost of making the wafers because the microelectronics companies just bought it and they didn't see it as a big input to their business. They didn't demand that the wafers be that much cheaper because it's not that significant of a fraction of our input cost. With the solar companies, it was a big fraction of the input costs. So if you had to pay $20 for every wafer and your solar panel had 60 wafers on it, that's a lot of money. And it's really hard to pay that back over 20 years by selling kilowatt hours for 5 cents a piece. So the solar industry kind of said, all right, we're going to figure out a cheaper way to make the wafers. And they did that through the 2010s, or through the 2000s, 2010s. And we are at the point here in 2024 where they're able to manufacture an entire solar panel, say a 400 watt solar panel. They could sell that for $60 or $70. Manufacturer can make that panel. That's really, really, really impressive. They can manufacture a solar panel for the same price per watt. I mean, no, it's not even that. It's not even that much. They can make an entire solar farm for the same price per watt as a combined cycle natural gas power plant. So this is where this guy with his question is starting to come into play here. We're able to make a solar farm and build it for the same price as building a combined cycle natural gas power plant. Just say $1,000 per kilowatt or $1 per watt. Right? The economics of that are startling. Because what is a solar farm uses fuel? Uses the sunlight, right? How do you get this fuel to the site of the solar farm? Well, you don't. You put the thing outside and the fuel comes to you. It just falls out of the sky, right? What does a natural gas combined cycle plant use as fuel? Well, natural gas, dummy, right? How do you get the natural gas to the site? Well, you have to build a pipeline to bring it in from somewhere. And does it just come by itself for free? No. You need to pay for that gas. And that becomes a really, really big operational expense. Whereas a solar farm, there is no fuel to buy. Amazing. This is the difference. So these guys out here that are stuck in this mindset of you buy fuel, you set it on fire, you make heat and make steam and turn a turbine. That is outdated. Right? That technology is not cost competitive with solar farms or wind farms for that matter, because they don't have any fuel. There's no fire. There's nothing to purchase. You build the thing you need and it just runs. And then, let's just read our Quora response here. So the original question was, is it true that renewable energy is more expensive? The response is yes. Most of our current forms of renewable energy are always more expensive. Hydroelectric is renewable and its cost is on par with the other major forms of energy, for example, coal, natural gas, and nuclear. Wind and solar, the forms we most commonly associate with being renewable, are always more expensive. Right? Because they are intermittent, meaning that they are not reliable to be there whenever needed. The wind does not always blow or sometimes blows too hard for the turbines to operate. The sun does not shine at night, solar does not work at night, and battery power is extremely inefficient. Wow, right? Therefore, in order for us to have a reliable supply of energy, we have to build 100% of our capacity out of a reliable source: coal, natural gas, nuclear. Thus, every dime spent on renewables is essentially wasted. Wow, right? That is why renewables are more expensive and always will be. This does not even take into account all the mining that is required to provide wind and solar energy. that mining is done with diesel fuel or petroleum, there is a tremendous cost to our land, water, and air created by this mining, most of which is done in countries with little or no environmental standards. The USA has replaced much of its coal electric generation with natural gas and has lowered CO2 emissions by more than any other country. We need to do that more, not less. Wow, right? It's kind of funny because this general set of arguments is the same general set of arguments that I get from, just checking some time here, that I get from every single person that tries to argue about why renewable energy sucks and we shouldn't be using it. It's almost like they're all reading the same book. So you go to the IEA, you go to the EIA, you go to Lazard, you go to all these different entities out in the world, all these independent groups in different countries and different places, and they all come to the same conclusion, that renewable energy in the form of wind power and solar power are cheaper than burning fuel in the vast majority of locations around the world. Especially Europe, where most of the fossil fuel has to be imported, right? Particularly there. China, Japan, Korea, all these places where they have to import coal and gas for power generation. You're going to be better off using renewables because it doesn't need a constant supply of lightable, ignitable, flammable, combustible material. It just lays out in the sun and soaks up the light and soaks up the photons and turns it into electrons. We have this notion that the intermittency of renewable energy is a deal breaker. There's these people that have this mindset that because it gets dark at night, man, those engineers are so stupid, right? They just don't realize that what happens? It gets dark at night. Man, the wind stops blowing, you can't watch TV. Oh my God, right? The engineers are just idiots. They don't think of these things. Imagine that, right? You're a designer of solar farms. Oh man, you got somebody comes up to you and says, "How stupid are you? It gets dark at night. What do you do at night?" Like, I don't know. How do you even respond to that? Do you think that the energy that you generate during the day has no value just because you're not producing it at night? Right? When the wind's blowing and you're producing electricity from the wind, and the wind stops or slows down, all this that makes the energy that you produced when it was blowing, it makes it that there's no value to it. Where does this mentality come from? Why do we have people who have this all or nothing view where the technology sucks because there's certain times of the day where it doesn't operate or doesn't operate to the standard that you think it should operate? What I find is just that, really interesting about this. And then we got the standard speech about the mining for materials. It seems like in the past 3 years, since 2021, there has been this upwelling of concern, or I'm going to call it concern trolling, over materials used to manufacture the equipment, to make the solar cells, to make the wind turbine blades, to make all the components. Why are we concerned about those things, but we're not concerned about manufacturing a steam turbine, or boilers, or condensers, or cooling towers, or all of the tankers and trains and rail cars and things that you need to dig the coal from the mines? You're digging up 500 million tons of coal in the US every year, and you're setting it all on fire. And we're worried about mining iron ore to make a racking for a solar farm. Where does this come from? If you do the math, a solar panel produces 100 times its weight in coal equivalent over say a 20-year lifetime. Why are we so hung up on the notion that mining of materials is a problem for renewable energy, but it's not a problem for fossil fuels. How is this getting into our heads? It's just hilarious. You know, they've done life cycle analysis on solar photovoltaics, you know, solar cells. The most commonly cited number is 45 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Oh, you idiots said that solar was carbon free. How could you say that? You're saying there's 45 grams. Okay, that comes from the mining of these materials. It comes from the manufacturing and the purification of all the stuff and fabricating it into a solar cell and putting it in a module and getting it to where it needs to be. You end up with 45 grams carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Compare it to this guy's favorite fuel appears to be natural gas, which emits 400 grams per kilowatt hour just from burning the fuel, not including the cost of making all the equipment that we need to build the power plant in the first place. All right. This is a very interesting psychological phenomenon, and I have the feeling the only cure for this is time and exposure. Society will eventually move past this mentality because the fact of the matter is industry chooses the technologies which provide the best bang for your buck. And here, as we speak, those technologies are solar and wind energy. Even when you consider the fact that you might have to throw in some battery storage once you get to 30 or 40% solar penetration on a system. Guess what? That's what industry is building. That's what they're deploying. Because it's easy, it's fast, it's cheap. It doesn't require burning fuel. There's no regulatory uncertainty. There's no issues with waste materials, ashes, and exhaust gases that you have to be concerned about somebody dealing with. You know, people will always troll me over the issue of capacity factors. And they look at sites like this and they say, whoa, look at this. Nuclear power plants have a 92.6% capacity factor. Man, they're really good, right? Well, the reason that nuclear power plants have such high capacity factors is because if you run it any less, you'll lose money. Okay? This has to run balls to the wall in order to pay off its costs, especially if you're building a new plant. You got to pay back that mortgage, that billions and billions of dollars. In the case of Plant Vogtle, units 3 and 4, it was $15,000 per kilowatt. 15 times what it costs to build a solar farm or even a combined cycle gas-fired power plant. They have to run that high. But if we look down here, here's solar photovoltaic, 23.1%. People look at that number, oh, 23, that number's low, right? Well, then why in the world can we have natural gas steam turbine power plants with 13% capacity factors that are out there in the world in business? How do they survive if 23% capacity factor sucks? They have to pay for fuel. Wow. How do these guys make a living? Well, they sell into the market when the prices are high. They're the stopgap. They're the people who are there for when Winter Storm Uri blows through or Winter Storm Elliott comes through and the demand goes from 0 to 100 in 3 hours, and they're the ones who will turn the lights on and get the place up and running, and they take $1,000 a megawatt hour in return for that service. Or they get capacity payments from the utility just to sit and do nothing for 98% of the year. Right? So this simplistic idea of renewable energy being more expensive is outdated, and it's pervasive. And I don't think that I'm going to succeed in convincing anybody to the contrary, because they're just going to take my attitude here and assume that I'm an asshole. But at the end of the day, that's it. That's all we got right there.